Hi everyone! Do you remember last term we read The Twits together? A book by Roald Dahl. Some of you said you had seen the movie Matilda, and some of you said you have read or seen Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. There are loads of books by Roald Dahl. He's a great author. This is the front cover of the one we're going to read, George's Marvellous Medicine. I'm looking forward to reading this with you, and there are a couple of activities I've got planned throughout the term. We'll read this between now and Chinese New Year. Here we go. I was going to make voices for the characters when I was practicing, but I don't think I can keep it up for the whole book. It is 82 pages long. I wonder how many chapters that is. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1 is called Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get up to any mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he might get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then she went out, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye. She was dozing, that's like sleeping a little bit. She opened one little eye and said, "Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine." "No, Grandma," said George politely. "And just try to behave yourself while she's away." "Yes, Grandma," said George. I'm already thinking I might know one of the problems that Roald Dahl has decided to write into this story. Do you want to turn and talk? What do you think the problem is already? Three, two, one. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles from anywhere. So there was never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at the pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house with the grizzly old grunion of a grandma. We already knew that, right? She doesn't seem very nice already. Look after her all by myself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning, he thought. "You can make me a nice cup of tea to start with," Grandma said to George. "That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes." "Yes, Grandma," said George politely. George couldn't help disliking his grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small puckered mouth, like a dog's bottom. "How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma?" George asked. "1 spoonful and no milk." Most grandmas are lovely and kind and helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in the chair by the window, and she was always complaining and grousing and grumping and grumbling and griping about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had George seen her smile. And she never said, "Well, how are you this morning, George?" Or, "Why don't we have a game of snakes and ladders, George?" Or, "How was school today, George?" She didn't care about other people, only herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. "It's not sweet enough. Put in more sugar." George took the cup politely back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully to Grandma. Where's the saucer? I won't have a cup of tea without a saucer. A saucer is the plate underneath the cup. George went and fetched the saucer politely. What about a teaspoon? If you please. I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I've stirred it really well. I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much. Fetch me a teaspoon. Oh, she is really difficult. Don't think I would like to live with her. George, of course, politely went and fetched her a teaspoon. When George's parents were home, Grandma never ordered George about like this. It was only when she had him as on her own that she was treating him so badly. You know what's the matter with you? The old woman said, staring at George over the rim of the teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become so lazy. But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma, George said. Of course you can. Growing's a nasty habit. We have to grow, Grandma. If we don't grow, we'll never be grown-ups. But you did once, Grandma. Oh, she said, rubbish, boy, rubbish, look at me. I'm not growing. Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only very little, the lady said. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty, childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and silliness. You haven't given up on any of those, have you? Oh, I'm still only a little boy, said George to Grandma. You're 8 years old, she snorted. That's old enough to know better. And if you don't stop growing, it'll be too late. Too late for what, Grandma? It's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me already. George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short she had to have a footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up the back of the armchair. Okay, my head comes over the back. Hers only goes halfway up the back. Oh. Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall, said George. Don't listen to your daddy, said Grandma. Listen to me. But how do I stop myself growing? Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow the wrong way. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes off the little boy. Whoa, I like that expression. She sipped her tea, but she never took her eyes off the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up. Always down. Yes, Grandma. Now, I can already see that Roald Dahl, the author, has made a really good character, because this Grandma is terrible and George seems super nice. So they're completely different, which makes it an exciting story. The other thing is, she's a bit wacky. She's telling him, only grow down, don't grow up. So you can have silly stories and makes it much more fun for us to read. And stop eating chocolate, eat cabbage instead. Oh no, I don't like cabbage, said George. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in it, much better. Oh, said George. Caterpillars give you brains, said Grandma. Mummy washes them down the sink, said George. Mummy's as silly as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs too. Oh, not slugs, George cried out. I can't eat slugs. Here's a picture of Grandma. has a picture of him thinking about the slugs. Look at Grandma's fingers and her nose. Quentin Blake is such a good illustrator. Whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, said Grandma, I gobble it up quickly before it crawls away. Delicious. She squeezed her lips together tight so that her mouth became a tiny wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you, little boy. You're joking, right, Grandma? I never joke. Beetles are perhaps best of all. They go crunch. Grandma, that's beastly. The old lady grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a beetle inside the stem of a stick of celery. That's what I like. Do you think she's joking? I'm not sure. Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in celery. Sometimes it's got earwigs. Oh, I don't want to hear about it, cried George. A big fat earwig. It's very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you've got to be very quick, my dear, when you put one of those in your mouth. It has a pair of sharp nippers at the back end, and if it grabs your tongue, it'll never let you go. So you've got to bite the earwig first, chomp chomp, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away as possible from this filthy old woman. You're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing a finger straight at George's face. You're trying to get away from Grandma. Little George stood by the door staring at the old lady in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he wasn't so sure. Come closer to me, little boy, she said, beckoning. That's this. Beckoning with her horny, wrinkly finger. Come closer to me and I will tell you a secret. George did not move. Grandma didn't move either. I know a great many secrets, she said, and suddenly she smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, the kind a snake might make just before it bites you. Come over here to Grandma and she'll whisper secrets to you. Ugh. Lucky she's Grandma, otherwise you'd run away. George took a step backwards, edging closer to the door. You mustn't be frightened. I'm your Grandma, she said, smiling an icy smile. Icy like ice, not warm like the sun. Icy smile. George took another step backwards. Some of us, she said. And all at once she was leaning forward in her chair, whispering in a throaty sort of voice George had never heard her use before. Let me try to make a voice that sounds as if it comes from here. Some of us have magic powers that can twist the creatures of the earth into wondrous shapes. Ooh, a tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine, like lightning down his spine. He began to feel frightened. Some of us, the old woman went on, have fire on our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry in the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand straight up on end and your eyes pop out of their sockets. George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. We know how to make your nails drop off and your teeth grow instead of fingernails. George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him most, or the frosty smile and the brilliant, unblinking eyes. Whoa, she hadn't blinked that whole time. Unblinking eyes. She was like this. Turn to your partner and see if you can stare at them and not blink. 3, 2, 1. We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from your behind. Grandma, he cried, stop! We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other. George made a dive for the door. It doesn't matter how far you run, he heard her saying. You won't ever get away. George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Okay, now, that's the end of chapter 1. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to turn and talk to your neighbor. Listen carefully. I want you to turn and talk to your neighbor and tell them what you think is going to happen in chapter 2. Good.